A CEO followed her employee home after he asked for leftover food. What she saw that night changed everything. Elizabeth Harper had spent over a decade at the helm of Harper Company, a thriving restaurant chain known for its upscale dining and polished reputation. She'd reviewed countless employee requests in her career. Most were predictable: schedule tweaks, payroll questions, the occasional plea for a day off. But one evening, as she lingered in her sleek, glass-walled office, long after the boardroom had emptied, a single request stopped her cold. It wasn't a grievance or a bold demand. It was quiet, almost painfully modest. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? Elizabeth's brow furrowed as she read the name attached: Daniel Carter, a line cook at their flagship location downtown. He'd been with the company for just over a year, reliable, punctual, the kind of worker who never made waves. No tardiness, no sick days, always the last to leave the kitchen. But this request gnawed at her. Employees didn't usually submit formal requests for leftovers. If they wanted extra food, they'd ask a manager casually or sneak a portion from the prep line when no one was looking. Why had Daniel gone through the trouble of putting it in writing? Was he afraid of breaking some unspoken rule? Or was there something more? Elizabeth wasn't one for sentimentality. She'd climbed the corporate ladder with a sharp mind and a cool head, her focus fixed on profit margins and expansion plans, not the personal lives of her staff. She prided herself on running a tight-ship Harper & Co, paid above industry standard, offered decent benefits, and boasted a family-oriented culture plastered across their marketing materials. But as she stared at Daniel's words on her screen, a flicker of unease stirred in her chest. She pulled up his file. 24 years old, no spouse, no emergency contacts listed. That struck her as strange. No family, no one to call in a pinch. She leaned back in her leather chair, tapping her pen against the desk. Maybe he was just thrifty, trying to stretch his paycheck. Plenty of employees live paycheck to paycheck, even at a company like hers. But the phrasing, "would it be possible," felt less like frugality and more like desperation. He didn't just want the food, he needed it. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt a tug of curiosity she couldn't ignore. She glanced out the window at the city lights twinkling below, then back at her laptop. Daniel's shift would end soon. Without overthinking it, she grabbed her coat, locked her office, and slipped out through the back exit. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find, maybe nothing at all, but something told her she had to see this through. Little did she know, what she was about to witness would unravel everything she thought she understood about her company and herself. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. The parking lot was nearly deserted, save for a handful of late-shift workers wrapping up. Through the kitchen's back door, Elizabeth caught sight of Daniel. He was scrubbing down the stainless steel counters, his short black hair damp with sweat from hours under the grills. His movements were swift and precise, honed by repetition. A manager approached, handing him a brown paper bag, presumably the leftovers he'd requested. He gave a quick nod of thanks, tucking it under his arm with care, as if it were something precious. Elizabeth watched as he untied his apron, folded it with almost military neatness, and slung a frayed backpack over his shoulder. Then he stepped into the night, heading for the bus stop down the street. Elizabeth lingered by the building, her breath fogging in the cool air. She wasn't sure why she didn't just turn back, call it a night, let this be someone else's problem. But watching Daniel walk away, after what she knew had been a double shift, she felt an odd pang of disconnect. Her life was one of luxury: chauffeured cars, business class flights, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. The idea of waiting for a late-night bus after 16 hours on your feet was as foreign to her as another language. And that realization, how little she knew about the people who kept her company running, propelled her forward. She slid into her silver SUV, hesitating before starting the engine. Daniel stood under the bus stop's flickering streetlight, arms crossed, shifting his weight as if to keep warm. The bus was late. When it finally rumbled into view, he boarded without a glance back. Elizabeth followed, keeping a careful distance. She told herself she wasn't spying, just observing. But deep down, she knew this was more than idle curiosity. Something about Daniel's quiet request had cracked open a question she couldn't shake. What kind of life was he going back to? The bus wove through the city, its route stretching longer than Elizabeth had expected. She trailed behind, her headlights cutting through the dark. With each stop, she thought he'd disembark, but he stayed put. The streets grew rougher as they went. Neon signs gave way to shuttered storefronts, manicured lawns to overgrown lots bordered by chain-link fences. The city's gleaming skyline faded in her rearview mirror, replaced by a patchwork of sagging houses and cracked sidewalks. This wasn't the polished world Harper and Company inhabited. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel tugged the yellow cord and stepped off. Elizabeth eased her SUV to a stop at the end of the street, watching as he walked with purpose, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of a lone street lamp. It wasn't a dangerous area, but it was desolate, hardly a place to linger alone at night. Then he turned a corner and vanished behind a row of rusting cars. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She edged forward, her pulse quickening despite herself. And then she saw it, not an apartment building, not even a modest house, but a trailer. Its faded exterior was patched with duct tape, the roof sagging under years of neglect. Daniel climbed the rickety steps, balancing the paper bag as he fumbled with a key. A faint light blinked on inside, spilling through threadbare curtains. Elizabeth stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't what she'd imagined, not even close. But what came next hit her even harder. She parked a block away, far enough to stay unnoticed. Her hands felt clammy against the wheel. Why was he living here? Daniel had been with her company for over a year, pulling full-time hours, often more. She didn't have his exact pay memorized, but it was well above minimum wage, enough to cover a basic apartment in the city. Or so she'd assumed. Yet here he was, stepping into a trailer that looked one storm away from collapse. Through the window, she glimpsed a cramped interior. Stained walls, a threadbare carpet, no hint of comfort, just the bare bones of survival. Then she saw movement. 3 small figures darted from the shadows, children, no older than 10 or 11. They swarmed Daniel before he could set the bag down, their arms wrapping around his waist. He let out a soft laugh, ruffling their hair, his weariness melting into something gentler. Elizabeth's throat tightened. They couldn't be his kids, too young for that. Siblings, maybe? Then an older man shuffled into view, his frame stooped and fragile, gray hair thinning atop his head. A grandfather, perhaps. Daniel guided him to a chair with a tenderness that belied his exhaustion, murmuring something Elizabeth couldn't hear. He turned to the paper bag, unpacking its contents with care and dividing the food onto 4 plates, not 5. The kids attacked their portions eagerly, eating as if they'd learned to savor every bite. The old man ate more slowly, his trembling hands fumbling with the fork. Daniel sat with them, a plate in front of him, but Elizabeth noticed something that made her stomach lurch. He wasn't eating. He mimicked the motions, cutting, shifting food around, nodding as the kids chattered. But not once did he take a bite. He was giving up his share to stretch the meal for them. Her chest constricted. She'd come here expecting what? A struggling bachelor, maybe? Pinching pennies to get by? Not this. Not a young man sacrificing his own hunger to feed a family after working himself to the bone. She thought of her own evening sipping wine over a gourmet meal she'd barely touched, the leftovers scraped into the trash without a second thought. The cost of that dinner could have fed Daniel's family for a week. Here he was, in a crumbling trailer, pretending to eat so the kids wouldn't worry. This wasn't just hardship, it was a quiet, crushing kind of heroism. And it exposed a truth Elizabeth couldn't unsee. Her company, her system, had failed him. She sat there, the silence of the street pressing in around her. Daniel smiled as the kids talked, his tired eyes warm despite the shadows beneath them. He was trying to keep their spirits up. She could see it in the way he leaned in, listening intently. But when their heads were turned, he rubbed his temples, his shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. Then the oldest girl spoke up, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Did you eat at work today?" Elizabeth held her breath, watching Daniel's face. For a fleeting moment, his mask slipped just a twitch of hesitation before he plastered on that same weary smile. "Yeah, I had something earlier," he said, too smoothly. The girl frowned, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't press him. She just nodded and went back to her food. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a one-off. He'd been doing this, skipping meals, stretching scraps for weeks, maybe months. Day after day, he hauled himself to work, stood over blazing grills, served plates he couldn't afford to taste, then came home to this. And he did it all without a word of complaint. She sank back in her seat, the reality sinking in like a stone. Inside, Daniel cleared the empty plates as the kids yawned and shuffled toward a curtained-off corner, presumably their sleeping area. The grandfather eased into a recliner, its upholstery worn to threads. Elizabeth squinted, piecing it together. The trailer was tiny, barely big enough for one, let alone four. Then she spotted it. A thin mattress wedged near the kitchen, a single blanket folded at its edge. That was Daniel's bed. After 16-hour shifts, after pouring every ounce of himself into his job and his family, that's where he slept. She couldn't look away, Harper & Co. touted itself as a beacon of employee care health plans, annual retreats, glossy brochures boasting we take care of our own. Elizabeth had sat through countless meetings where executives patted themselves on the back for competitive wages and morale-boosting perks. Yet here was Daniel, one of her most dedicated workers, living in squalor, starving himself to keep his family afloat, all while she sipped espresso from a machine that cost more than his monthly rent. She thought of the food tossed out nightly at her restaurants, trays of uneaten appetizers, half-finished entrees, all dumped into bins while people like Daniel went hungry. The waste, the disparity had hit her like a punch. Elizabeth didn't drive home that night. She couldn't. She stayed parked there, staring at the trailer long after its lights dimmed. Her mind churned. How many others were like Daniel, smiling through their shifts while their lives crumbled? She pictured the corporate budget, six-figure executive bonuses, lavish ad campaigns, a new office remodel she'd greenlit last quarter. Then she pictured that mattress on the floor. Her hands clenched the wheel until her knuckles ached. This wasn't just his failure, it was hers. She'd built her career on the backs of people like him, and she'd never bothered to look down. For years, she'd convinced herself her employees were fine. She'd signed off on policies, skimmed HR reports, nodded along to assurances of industry-leading support, but she'd never dug deeper. Tonight, she had, and the truth was unbearable. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her head of operations. Marcus. It rang twice before his groggy voice answered. "Ma'am, everything okay?" "No," she said, her tone like steel. "Everything is not okay." A beat of silence. "What's wrong?" he asked, suddenly alert. Elizabeth glanced at the trailer one last time, her resolve hardening. "We're fixing this. All of it. Be in my office at dawn." She hung up before he could reply. This wasn't up for debate, it was an order, and she was only beginning. The next morning, Elizabeth stormed into the office with a fire she hadn't felt in years. She didn't wait for pleasantries or coffee. By mid-morning, she'd assembled her senior team operations, HR, finance, and laid out the problem in stark terms. "We've got people working themselves to death while we throw out food they're begging for," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "This ends now." Policies were overhauled on the spot. Leftover food became a resource package daily and offered free to any employee who wanted it. No questions asked. Wages were audited and raised, and with a new baseline ensuring no full-timer fell below a living standard. An emergency fund was established, seeded with a chunk of the marketing budget she'd slashed without hesitation. "No more billboards until our people can eat," she snapped when the CFO balked. But she didn't stop there. Elizabeth demanded a full review of every employee file, hours worked, pay rates, personal circumstances. She wanted to know who else was slipping through the cracks. By week's end, a task force was in place, tasked with identifying and supporting struggling workers. And Daniel? He arrived at his shift the next day as usual, apron tied, head down until his manager called him aside. She handed him an envelope. Inside was a raise substantial, life-changing enough to move his family into a proper apartment, enough to buy groceries without guilt, enough to let him breathe for the first time in years. He stared at it, speechless, then looked up with a question in his eyes. "The company's making some changes," the manager said simply. "You've earned this." Word spread quickly. Employees whispered about the new policies, the sudden shift in priorities. Some called it a PR stunt. Others saw it for what it was, a reckoning. Elizabeth didn't care what they thought. She wasn't doing it for applause. She was doing it because she'd seen Daniel's trailer, his mattress, his empty plate, and she couldn't unsee it. Over the next month, she visited every Harper & Company location herself, talking to workers, listening to their stories. She met single parents juggling two jobs, veterans scraping by on part-time hours, students drowning in debt. Each conversation chipped away at the polished image she'd built of her company and fueled her determination to rebuild it. Daniel and his family moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment a few weeks later. Elizabeth didn't tell him she'd been there that night. She didn't need to. But when she saw him in the kitchen one day, laughing with a coworker over a plate of food he was actually eating, she felt something shift inside her. She'd come to work that month as a CEO. She was leaving it as something more. The changes rippled beyond Harper and Company. Competitors took notice, some following suit with their own reforms. Local news ran a story, restaurant chain, CEO overhauls policies after employees' plight, though Elizabeth refused interviews. She didn't want the spotlight. She wanted results. And yet, the question lingered in her mind, and in the minds of those who heard Daniel's story. How many people around us are struggling in silence? How often do we look away? If you have the power to help, even in the smallest way, don't wait. Do something today.